Kris Kristofferson had 90 minutes. If he landed the helicopter where he wasn't supposed to, walked into a house he'd never been invited to, and handed a tape to someone who didn't know his name, something permanent would shift. If security stopped him at the lawn, 5 years of writing in secret would stay secret. The Gulf of Mexico stretched below, flat and indifferent. He'd been flying oil rig supply routes for 8 months. Good pay. Predictable. The kind of work that didn't ask questions about what you did when you weren't working. The demo tape sat in his flight bag, wrapped in a torn brown envelope. 4 songs, recorded in a friend's garage on borrowed equipment. He'd mixed them himself, late, when no one else was there to hear what he was trying to get right. No one at the rig knew he wrote songs. They knew he'd been to college. They knew he didn't talk much about it. That was enough. He checked his fuel, checked his course. The tape had been in that bag for 2 weeks. He'd planned to mail it. Then he'd planned to hand it to someone at a label. Then he'd realized no one at a label would listen to a tape from someone they'd never heard of. But June Carter might. Not because she knew him. She didn't. Because if he showed up at her house, uninvited, unannounced, in a helicopter, she'd at least remember it happened. The plan wasn't rational. It was specific. He'd finish the shift, fly back toward Nashville, land in the field near Johnny Cash's house, walk to the door, hand June the tape, leave before anyone called the police. If it worked, she'd listen. If it didn't, he'd have a story about the time he made the worst career decision possible. The rig came into view. He descended carefully. The crew didn't care about careful. They cared about on time. He was always on time. He landed. Engines off, rotors slowing. One of the workers waved. Kris waved back. Professional, unremarkable. He had 2 hours before the return route. He sat in the cockpit and thought about what he'd say if June opened the door. He'd practiced it, kept it short, didn't want to seem desperate, didn't want to seem confident either. Just present, someone who'd made a decision and followed through. The workers loaded supplies. He checked the tape again. Still there, still wrapped. He'd written his name on the envelope in block letters, just in case she wanted to know who to avoid in the future. The flight back was smooth. He didn't think about what could go wrong. He thought about what he'd do if nothing happened at all. If she took the tape politely and never listened. If Johnny answered the door instead and told him to leave. Those seemed more likely than success. Nashville appeared on the horizon. He adjusted his route, not toward the airport, toward the coordinates he'd memorized from a map he'd studied for 3 weeks. He'd never flown to someone's house before. The rules were clear. You didn't land in unauthorized areas. You didn't use a company helicopter for personal reasons. You didn't show up uninvited at someone's home. He was about to do all 3. The house came into view, bigger than he'd expected, trees around it, a lawn that looked maintained. He circled once, no cars in the driveway. That could mean no one was home, or it could mean they parked in back. He descended. The helicopter's noise would announce him long before he reached the door. There was no way to do this quietly. That was part of the problem, and part of the point. He touched down in the field adjacent to the property, not on the lawn. That felt like a line he shouldn't cross. The field was close enough. Engines off. He sat for 5 seconds, then 10. The tape was in his hand now. He hadn't planned to grab it this fast, but if he waited, he'd think of reasons not to go. He opened the door, stepped out. The air smelled like cut grass and aviation fuel. The house was 60 yards away. He started walking. No one came out to meet him. No one yelled. The helicopter sat behind him, still ticking as it cooled. He didn't look back. The lawn was soft under his boots. He kept his pace even, not rushing, not hesitating, just walking like someone who had a reason to be there. He reached the porch. There was a doorbell. He pressed it, waited. No sound from inside. He pressed it again. Still nothing. He knocked 3 times. Firm but not aggressive. The door opened. June Carter stood there, drying her hands on a towel. She looked at him, then past him toward the helicopter in the field. She didn't say anything. Kris held up the tape. "I'm a songwriter," he said. "I flew here to give you this." She looked at the tape, then at him. "You flew here?" "Yes, ma'am. In that." She didn't take the tape yet. "What's on it?" "4 songs. I think you'd understand them." She studied his face. He didn't look away, didn't smile, didn't apologize. "You always deliver demos this way?" she asked. "First time." She took the tape. "What's your name?" "Kris Kristofferson." She turned the envelope over, saw his name already written there. "You planned this long?" "Long enough." She nodded once. "I'll listen to it." "That's all I'm asking." She glanced toward the helicopter again. "You planning to leave the same way you came? Unless you'd rather I didn't." A small smile. "I think you better." He nodded, turned, walked back across the lawn. She didn't close the door until he reached the field. He climbed into the cockpit, started the engine. The rotors spun up. He lifted off, angled away from the house, and flew toward the airport. He didn't know if she'd actually listen. He didn't know if the songs were good enough, but he knew he'd done the one thing he could do that no one else would, shown up in a way she couldn't ignore. The flight back was quieter than the flight there. He returned the helicopter, filed his post-flight report. Everything standard, no mention of the detour, no one asked. He went home. 3 days passed, no call, no letter, nothing. He told himself that was expected, that even if she listened, it didn't mean anything would happen. Labels heard thousands of demos. Artists heard more. One tape from a guy who landed a helicopter in a field wasn't going to change that. But he'd known that before he went. On the 4th day, his phone rang. A voice he didn't recognize. Someone from Johnny Cash's team. They wanted to know if he had more songs. He said yes. They said June had played the tape for Johnny. Johnny wanted to meet him. Kris didn't ask which song they'd liked, didn't ask if they thought he had a future, just asked when and where. 2 weeks later, he was in a studio in Nashville. Not as a janitor, not as someone who cleaned up after sessions, as someone recording. Johnny was there, watching, listening. Kris played the songs he'd been writing in silence for 5 years, the ones he'd never had a reason to share, the ones he thought might matter if anyone ever heard them. Johnny didn't say much, just nodded between takes, asked him to play one of them again. When the session ended, Johnny shook his hand. "That helicopter thing," Johnny said. "That was smart." Kris didn't correct him. It hadn't been smart. It had been necessary. "June said you didn't apologize for showing up," Johnny continued. "Didn't seem like the right move." Johnny smiled. It wasn't. Kris left the studio with a contact, a possibility, and the knowledge that the tape had done exactly what he'd needed it to do, get listened to. Not because it was brilliant, because he'd made it impossible to ignore. The oil rig job ended a month later. He didn't go back. There were other jobs, other shifts, other ways to pay rent, while he figured out if the songs would actually lead somewhere. But the helicopter flight stayed with him, not as a story he told at parties, as a reminder that the distance between unknown and known wasn't talent. It was willingness to do something no one else would do. He wrote more songs, played more sessions. Slowly, people started to know his name. But when someone asked how he got his start, he kept it brief. Handed a demo to June Carter. He didn't mention the helicopter unless they asked. Most didn't. The ones who did wanted to know if he'd been nervous. He hadn't. Nervousness required uncertainty. He'd known exactly what he was doing. He'd known it might not work. He'd known it was the only chance that felt like his. That wasn't nervousness. That was clarity. Years later, after the songs had become hits, after the acting roles, after Nashville knew his name the way he'd once known theirs, someone asked him if he'd do it again. The helicopter, the uninvited landing, the hand-delivered tape. He thought about it. No, he said. Not because it had been reckless, because it had already worked. You didn't repeat the thing that changed everything. You just lived with the fact that you'd been willing to try it. The tape itself, the one he'd handed to June, he never got back. He assumed she'd kept it or lost it or filed it somewhere with 100 others. It didn't matter. What mattered was that for 90 minutes, he'd flown toward a decision most people would call unhinged. And when he'd landed, he hadn't second-guessed it. He'd walked to the door, knocked, handed over the work, and left before anyone could tell him he shouldn't have come. That was the part no one talked about, not the audacity, the timing. He'd left before the moment could become uncomfortable, before June could feel obligated to say something kind. Before the gesture could turn into an imposition, he'd made it easy for her to listen because he'd made it easy for her to forget he'd been there. That took more discipline than the flight. The songs on that tape became some of the ones he was known for, not all of them. but enough. And when people heard them, they didn't think about a helicopter in a field. They thought about the lyrics, the phrasing, the perspective, which was the point. The delivery was just what it took to get them heard. He never framed it as bravery. Bravery implied fear. He hadn't been afraid of rejection. He'd been afraid of never knowing if the songs were good enough. There's a difference. One keeps you waiting, the other puts you in a helicopter. June told the story sometimes, in interviews, years later. She'd laugh, say it was the most memorable demo delivery she'd ever seen. Kris never corrected her version, but his version was quieter. In his version, the flight wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about removing every excuse he'd been carrying. If she didn't listen, it wouldn't be because he hadn't tried hard enough. It wouldn't be because he'd been too polite or too patient or too afraid to take up space. It would just be because the songs weren't what she wanted to hear. And he could live with that. What he couldn't live with was wondering. So he flew, he landed, he handed her the tape, and then he left her alone with the only thing that mattered, the work itself. That's the part people miss when they tell the story. They focus on the helicopter. He focused on what happened after he walked away. Because that's when June had a choice. She could throw the tape out. She could forget his name. She could decide the whole thing was too strange to bother with. Or she could listen. And for reasons he'd never fully understand, she did. Not right away, not that night, but within a few days. Long enough that he'd started to accept it might not happen. Short enough that when the phone rang, he wasn't completely surprised. The conversation that followed wasn't dramatic. It was practical. They wanted more songs. They wanted to know what else he had. They wanted to see if the 4 on the tape were exceptions or indicators. He had more. He'd always had more. That was never the problem. The problem had been getting anyone to care. The helicopter solved that. Not because it was clever, because it was undeniable. When he thought about it later, much later, after everything that came from that one flight, he realized the real risk wasn't rejection. It was succeeding and then having nothing else to offer. But he'd written enough by then to know he had plenty else to offer. The tape was just the beginning. The helicopter was just the method. The songs were the reason any of it mattered. And when June listened, she didn't hear a stunt. She heard someone who'd spent years writing in private, refining something until it was ready to be shared. The helicopter just made sure she couldn't ignore the ask. Everything after that was up to the work. He understood that. He'd always understood that, which is why, when he walked back to the helicopter that day, he didn't look back at the house. He'd done what he came to do. Now the songs had to do the rest.